You're listening to episode 49 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Today's guest is Tim Ward, author of What the Buddha Never Taught, about his experiences as a Theravadan monk in Thailand. Hi, everyone. On this podcast, we've had two former monks who've written books about their experiences, Stephen Batchelor and Stephen Scattini, and today we'll have our third with Tim Ward. There's an underlying thread in their experiences in which personal resonance with a particular form of practice was lacking. It's not to say that it's not there for many, if not most Westerners who take on the robes, but the reasons why some have left Begging Bowl behind are very similar, if not identical. Many of the discussions lately on the Facebook fan page for The Secular Buddhist has centered on this topic that what's right for the individual, culturally, may not be right for another. And that's okay. Secular Buddhism is about creating an opportunity for practice and fostering communities of support for those who are more comfortable with a secular worldview. Many of us are less comfortable with the trappings of organized religion and supernatural explanations, and find more resonance with practicing in our own non-traditional way. As Buddhism expands in the West, it is inevitable that it find its own forms which reflect the culture in which it finds itself. Some of us deal quite well with faith approaches to practice. Others take a more skeptical view. But our practice, that of reducing suffering of self and others, remains. We share this vision, and however we get there, however winding the path, I find that the core practice of that path is the same. Published in 7 countries in 5 languages, What the Buddha Never Taught was a bestseller in Canada and a Book of the Month selection in the U.S. It has been used as a classroom text in several universities and as a great introduction to living Buddhism in the Theravada tradition. It was, however, notorious in Thailand for its candid observations. Tim Ward is the author of 5 books, including 3 spiritual travel adventures based on his 6 years living in Asia. His stories have appeared in 13 anthologies, including Best Travel Writing 2006 and 2010. Ward's commentaries on Asian life and culture have been broadcast by CBC Radio, and he gives frequent public talks based on his books. Tim still travels to South and East Asia several times a year, thanks to his work as an international communications consultant for economic, environmental, and development organizations. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice, flat Coke. Ice cold. No, really, no bubbles, ice cold Coke. It was one of my favorite drinks as a kid, and as many of you know, my growing up is still a long ways off. And we are here with Tim Ward, author of What the Buddha Never Taught. Tim, thanks so much for being here.
I'm so glad to be on your show, Ted.
We're here talking about your book, What the Buddha Never Taught, and in particular, I'm lucky enough I did go and get the 20th anniversary edition, which has a new foreword and an ending as well. For folks who are listening to the podcast on iTunes, I know I say this fairly frequently, so you've heard it before, but I tell you, go out to the webpage. In particular, I'm suggesting it for this one because although I did set up links to Tim's books, for this one, the 20th anniversary edition is available from Amazon.ca, and I've set up a link specifically for that one as well because I want to make sure you're able to get that. It worked really well for me. I got it in like 2 or 3 days. I was very impressed with how well that worked. So just making a note for the people listening, go out and do that. Tim, if you would, tell us a bit about your background and how, as a Westerner, you found enough value in Buddhism to head out to Wat Pah Nanachat.
Well, I was a typical North American kid. I grew up in Toronto and Ottawa in Canada, and then went to university in Vancouver. And I studied philosophy, although at the time that I was a student, I was also quite a zealous Christian. But even so, although that was my background, when I finished my degree, I really felt like I just knew like a fingernail's worth of the wisdom in the world. And I stood on the shore of that Pacific Ocean, and I looked across to the Far East, and I really just had this great desire to go and really understand what the majority of the people in the world believed in. So I worked for a couple of years, like a good Canadian on the oil rigs, saved up some money, bought a nice little tiny backpack, and then I took off with a one-way ticket to New Delhi. And I spent 2 years just traveling through India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Southeast Asia, including Thailand, and then into China, and ultimately Tibet. And part of that experience for me was stopping and staying at various monasteries and ashrams along the way. And one of the places that made the biggest impact on me was this lovely forest monastery in northeastern Thailand called Wat Nanachat, which means International Forest Monastery. And that was the place where What the Buddha Never Taught is set. So this is not my first monastery, and I'd already been sort of immersed in Buddhist company for a year in various different traditions. But this place really drew me because it was billed as trying to recreate as truly as possible the earliest Buddhist monastic practice, where the monks were really striving to follow the 227 precepts laid down by the Buddha as recorded in the Pali Canon.
Now, when you got there, through interesting circumstances, you became inextricably associated with another Westerner who showed up there named Jim. You became Bob and Boomer to each other. Tell us about that inevitable association and actually your continued friendship.
Yes. So this began right from the first moment that I arrived in the monastery. Now, they have to imagine, I didn't know exactly where this place was. I started out by bus from Bangkok in the pouring rain, and several rides and miscommunications later, I finally showed up in the outskirts of the jungle in which the monastery was in a little three-wheeled mini tuk-tuk, got off, started walking along this path until I saw light at the end, and this was the setting of Pah Nanachat. And one of the monks sort of found me there in the darkness and took me to the head monk's hut. And so we're now talking about 11 o'clock at night. The head monk gets woken up. He comes down the stairs from his sleeping quarters, and he sees me. And I say, "Hello, my name is Tim, and I'm here to study at the monastery." And he says, "Ah, yes, we've been expecting you." It's one of those mystical, holy crap.
Yeah. You're expecting Rod Serling to step out, a picture if you will.
So I'm floored by this. I go and I get set up in the place for guests for the night. And the next morning, as I'm eating breakfast in this sort of guest area, this other guy shows up, looking very much like me, a little backpack, and drops his bag down, and we start eating together. And it turns out his name is Jim, and he's an American. And when you travel for a long time, you understand that English accents vary quite widely from culture to culture, country to country. But Jim and my accents were very, very similar, and we then go back together to the Ajahns, the teacher's hut in the morning, and the Ajahn looks at Jim and looks at me and says, "Wait a minute, what's going on?" And Jim said, "Well, I wrote you and told you that I was coming a month ago." So it was actually Jim who he was expecting rather than me. Now, once Jim and I had both decided to join the community, You surrender your own clothes, and you're dressed in white clothes, basically make you look like somebody from a psychiatric ward. And then they shave your head as well. We both had very similar glasses, so with our heads shaved and in our white clothes and our similar accents, most of the monks in the monastery really couldn't tell us apart. So we became Tim and Jim. But whenever one of us appeared alone, we noticed nobody would actually say our name. So we talk about a loss of one's personal identity. We found ourselves in this strange symbiotic relationship. The other thing which was to me quite peculiar is Jim had been studying in Thailand for a year. It was his junior year abroad. So he spoke very good Thai, and he'd been really studying many of the intricacies of the Thai Buddhist tradition as well. He had memorized most of what you need to know in order to become ordained as a novice. I knew nothing. I was just literally almost straight off the boat from the Indian subcontinent. So, my knowledge was very different than his, and I knew no Thai whatsoever. But because I had arrived 12 hours earlier at the monastery, I was the senior of the two of us. So I did my best to lord it over Jim, who knew far more than I did. most of our time in the Wat. But one of the things which to me has been beautiful about having someone like Jim, I went from being alone to really feeling like I was thrown into this together with Jim. And his perspective on many things was very different from mine. So in the book, What the Buddha Never Taught, I've recorded and reenacted many of the dialogues that he and I had as we tried to work through a lot of the issues that we were facing, like how much of what we were learning depended on us understanding and practicing things which are very much part of the Thai tradition.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I liked best about the book is, in addition to raising significant questions on some ethical situations that you run into that we'll talk about in a few minutes, interspersed with this is your dialogue and relations with the other people who are in the community, with those that are out in the public when you travel around. And it's frequently with you and Jim, with your twin, it's like brothers talking. And there's one of the quotes you had in the book is one of you is meditating, the other comes up and says, "Earth to Bhikkhu Bob, do you read me? Bob to Boomer, Roger, I read you. Presently orbiting the third jhana, estimated re-entry in 90 seconds, stand by." And you have these entertaining situations that any one of us from a Western background will immediately understand what you're referring to and what's going on. And to me, that made reading through the book, which otherwise would be very foreign to me with your experiences there, extremely engaging. And that's one of the things I like best about it.
Thank you. Yeah, and it indeed that's a very realistic tone that we two of us had as, basically kids in our mid and early 20s here in this very somber, serious place. It was kind of a struggle to really figure out how do we fit in? How much sense does this make? We sort of really got the whole Buddhist task of meditating and mindfulness and striving towards this beautiful state of enlightenment. But boy, the path along the way seemed strewn with all of these hurdles, and sometimes we felt we were bashing our heads against it, and sometimes we, just got plain silly, he and I. And some people who've read the book have, really enjoyed and appreciated our intellectual struggles with this great Buddhist tradition. And some other people have read the book and said, "You guys sound like spoiled brats." I mean, there was one point where we were really, wondering, well, this whole idea of this calm, austere seriousness that the monks seem to be giving off, is this real, or is it just a facade that's made easy because the monastery supports that? And we were thinking, maybe we could, get a bucket of water and put it up above one of the doors to the washrooms and see if we could perform the whole classic gag of, soaking some monk when he goes to the bathroom in the middle of the night, and then we'll see if he's really practicing.
Yeah, put them to the test. Yeah.
We never, did anything as deliberately destructive as that. But these were the sorts of things that we were thinking about, and along our way we did have some minor misadventures of that sort, which, frankly, when I guess I should tell you about one of them, and that is I inadvertently embarrassed the entire monastery one time by taking pictures of one of the big dinners that we had on a special occasion. Not dinner, it was a breakfast, of course, because monks don't eat after lunch. But I sort of got my camera out to take some pictures of this festival, and to take the camera, I was, trying to take some good pictures. I was, squatting down and trying to get good images. And I noticed that, a lot of the Thais were laughing at me doing this. And I thought, oh, well, maybe this is somehow disrespectful. Nobody had told me about this. And I was a little bit concerned. And only later did one of the senior monks approach me and give me instructions on how to squat when wearing a robe so that one did not, as he put it, heedlessly expose one's testicles. I realized that when I had been taking the pictures and squatting down, I was exposing myself to all the visitors.
And I'm sure they never forgot that breakfast at the Wat. You remember when that Westerner kept showing it, kept flashing it? Yeah.
I know. So, the monk who explained this to me, again, in a rather delicate way, was not a particularly nice guy. He was a very dour individual who didn't like to speak at all. But he had taken it upon himself, or had been assigned, to sort of give me this instruction. And he did it in a way which was very gentle and did not make me feel bad for having humiliated the monastery and myself so thoroughly. So I certainly ended up with good experiences with the monks, even though Jim and I were quite frustrated some of the time at this sort of excess of austerity and somberness that we felt in the community.
Now, you and Jim have remained friends. Tell us a little bit about that, because you guys are still close today.
Sure, I will. Well, Jim left the monastery before I did. He found... and what he found the most difficult to bear is he found it difficult to have Westerners living on the largesse, generosity, and alms of the Thai villagers who supported the community. As I'm sure all your listeners know, in the Theravada tradition, monks do not touch or carry money. And they're not supposed to take anything. They're only supposed to receive what's given to them, which really makes monks very dependent on the communities around them. So every morning in the monastery, we had to go begging for rice in the village. We'd go to the local villages, and the villagers would come out and put rice and fish and vegetables in our bowls, and we'd take them all back and share that as a common meal. And some villagers would also show up to cook food for the monks as well. It's all a way of making metta, good karma, for them. And Jim felt that this was just really not right. And it was an ethical issue for him that he couldn't get over. He had no problem with villagers supporting their own sons in the local monasteries. But for the villagers to be supporting foreigners in this way, he felt really was indistinguishable from mooching. So that was just one of the several things that made him decide he had to leave. And it was really sad for me to let go of it. It was really like, feeling like a Siamese twin, having my twin
separated out,
cut loose. But we arranged to meet later on, and when I left the monastery, Jim was still in Thailand, so we met up in Chiang Mai, which is where he'd been studying, and we went for a trip together through the Golden Triangle. Now, the Golden Triangle is not as well known now as it was maybe 20 years ago, but that was the notorious northern tip of Thailand, where lots of drugs were illegally grown and processed, mostly marijuana, but also opium and things like that. Very close to the border of Burma, but it also contains all these beautiful ethnic tribes of northern Thailand, which still live in the jungle, and some of them are somewhat nomadic, some of them are more settled. So he and I spent some time thrashing around. We did this really the wrong way. We didn't have a map. I sort of drew something on the back of a piece of paper, and we just knew if we hit a road, we were in Burma. If we hit a dirt road, we were in Burma. If we hit a paved road, we were on the way back to civilization in Thailand. So we had experiences like that together in Asia, and then through the years we stayed in touch with each other. You know, I spent some time living in Japan. He spent some time in Taiwan. Would visit each other every now and then when we both moved back to North America, we just keep showing up at each other's door. So Jim was best man at my wedding, and he also sort of held my hand and was with me through my divorce. He's the godfather of my son. And he's somebody who I've always looked to read over the drafts of most of the manuscripts that I've turned into books ever since. In fact, he's been working with me right now on the newest book that I'm writing. So we've really stayed best buddies.
Yeah, it's excellent to see that kind of thing, that you do develop these relationships that you otherwise wouldn't necessarily find, and I've experienced that as well. There are good, what I would consider lifelong friends that I've met through week-long seminars or retreats or things like that, they become part of your life and part of your daily existence because they do remind us of those times and what we're working to achieve.
Exactly. I sometimes liken it to, Jim and I didn't go to war together. We didn't, fight in Vietnam or anything like that. We were too young, but we went to the Wat together.
Yeah. Should get T-shirts.
Yeah.
Now, you had some of the things you describe in the book is challenges with the rules. You talk about that a fair amount, that it seemed that the practice there wasn't so much here's instruction in the Dhamma and what to do. That was very minimal, at least at the time. But there was very much about living within the rules. Now, some of the challenges you had with that is that it seemed that there were situations where the monks wouldn't violate the rules, but would have others basically do it for them, killing mosquito larvae, cutting plants. Tell us a little bit about some of those situations and why that was problematic for you.
Yes. So I need to say a little bit more about the Vinaya, the Pali rule book, first.
Yeah, please.
To set the tone for this. These 227 precepts that the monks are given to follow, they're venerated within the Theravada tradition, almost like the Ten Commandments, maybe in the Judeo-Christian tradition, or any sort of monastic code of conduct. But because it's seen as coming down from the Buddha, it has this weight of tradition to it. And the point of all these rules is not that it's a good or bad thing. It's not like Christians would think of them as sins. It's more that these are the rules which will help your practice, so strive to follow them at all times.
Right.
Now, although some of these rules are moral, like don't have sex, don't steal, right? There's some very basic ones that a monk needs to follow. Some of them seem really arcane. There's like more than a dozen rules for how a monk must wash his bowl and hold his bowl. Some of these things seem kind of ludicrous. A monk must not put his bowl on the edge of a shelf. A monk must not hold his bowl by grasping it by the rim. He must support it with a hand under his bowl. Well, our bowls are these big sort of metal, not ceramic, but they were made of metal. They're indestructible. But back in the day, they were made of clay. So you had all these rules which made great sense if you're dealing with clay bowls, but make no sense logically if you're dealing with indestructible metal bowls. But the rules are still there. So I had a great deal of difficulty keeping many of these rules in mind, especially the one for washing bowls, which meant you had to kneel down in the ground to wash your bowls. Well, as a sort of technically a junior novice, one step below a novice, we wore white monk's robes rather than the traditional muddy brown ochre robes. So every time you'd kneel to wash your bowl in the dirt, you'd have to go wash all your clothes. So I kept trying to find ways to wash my bowl that didn't involve kneeling in the ground. I was told again and again, kneel in the ground, and I'd say, but it doesn't make any sense. Don't think of it as making sense. Your job is not to think about it, it's to follow the rules. Right? So let the rules be your guide to mindfulness. Now this is the key thing, there's a point of this that does make sense. The idea is that you should not be thinking about what to do next. You should merely be mindful of the rules and the code of conduct that you're given so that every action harmoniously fits with those rules. This way you can train your brain for mindfulness as opposed to the scattered bouncing around, what'll I do next, that we think of, especially in the West, as thinking. So there's this distinction between our sort of problem-solving thinking mind and the mindfulness mind. And you can, I think you can perhaps make a case for that. Certainly where the case comes out most strongly, and this is what we were told again, is when you find yourself resisting the rules, that's when you can see the imperfections in your own mind. And that's when you can let go of your desire to do things your way. Right? So, it comes right down to the struggling ego that doesn't want to obey somebody else's rules. And that, as explained, I think is the beauty of this system in terms of helping you see where you have struggles, see where you're clinging to a sense of self or a sense of stubborn independence that needs to be surrendered to achieve the Theravada vision of enlightenment and sort of a brain that's fertile for the task of meditation and enlightenment.
Now, how did that work with things like the work that needed to be done around the Wat that monks couldn't do themselves? Right.
So here's where the lofty philosophical system of Theravada Buddhism crashes with the realities of living in a jungle. So some of the monks' rules explicitly are, don't tip over a pot with water in it. Why? Because mosquito larvae or the larvae of other animals might be living in those water pots. However, big water pots are an important part of running a monastery. When you go to a bathroom or you use any other kind of water, it's all pulled out by cistern and stored in these big water pots for regular washing. And when those sit around for more than 2 or 3 days, even with a lid on them, they get organisms growing in them. So it was our job as junior members of the community who had not yet taken their 227 precepts as a vow. Even though we were supposed to follow those rules, we were supposed to sublimate that to doing what it takes to have the monastery functioning well, which included knocking over the water pots, which included cutting back vegetation in the jungle when it grew and encroached on the living space. Monks have a particular problem when it comes to cutting vegetation as well, because there's a rule that says a monk shall not cut vegetation, and another that says a monk shall not instruct anybody else to cut vegetation. So we ended up with these very sort of elaborate ways around the rules. The Ajahn would every now and then declare a work day. Euphemistically, that meant we all had to go get our tools and show up at whatever area he said we were having the work day. And then he would say, this area here appears to be a little overgrown, or this area could use some cleaning up.
Yeah. Well,
and we'd have to take those vague instructions to do these things. Another interesting wrinkle in the rule was if you were with a monk, you could make it allowable for him to cut a plant by saying, I copy you on that. That special word copy meant I make it allowable for you to do this. So there are these interesting wrinkles and gnarly ways around the rules that seem to me to sort of undercut this great, no, you must do this because this is how you cleanse your mind. And you turn around and you see the monks have got these scams going. Including the head monk. He had a delightful one. Intoxicants were prohibited, which he said that includes smoking, so no smoking is allowed. He said, but, chewing tobacco isn't explicitly prohibited, so
right.
We allow chewing tobacco, and I personally like chewing tobacco, so.
Yeah, and neither is cocaine, so you talk about this in the book. There's one section where you're out, and the monk says, or you say, oh, so you can't kill them. Why do you want me to dump it then? If you think it might have larvae in it, you can't dump it yourself or it's an offense, right? So you want me to dump it. And the monk says, I can't tell you that.
Yep.
And then later on, you're talking about cutting back plants, and you say, you say to the monk, if your intention is bring me all the way out here to cut plants, then aren't you going against your vows? It's just a convenient way of getting around an inconvenient rule. So why would one have rule then?
Right. And these were tough things for me. And the one thing which, I would be told by the senior monks when I brought some of these things up is, are you here to point out the flaws in the system, or are you here to learn and practice? And
which is not an answer.
Yeah, no, it's not an answer, but it also points to the fact that one of the big obstacles to Buddhist practice is making judgments and believing that your judgments are superior to others' judgments. So one thing's for sure, living in this monastery through me and through Jim, again and again, up against our own judgments about what should and should not be the case. And, there were times when it was obvious that our minds were just looking for something to latch onto and obsess about. So I think that the monastery still has a problem, and maybe given that you just got to run a monastery in certain ways, or it will return to the jungle. It's just plain a conflict with the rules that the monastery attempts to run itself by. I mean, maybe they should just hire a caretaker. But why would I, as somebody who's there as a guest, as a young person hoping to learn something from the monastery, why would I make it my business to try to point that out and correct it? Well, that really says more about the workings of my own mind than the workings of the monastery. I can only imagine, Ted, that for many of your own listeners for whom what to do with Buddhist tradition versus what to do with your own practice, your own way of making your way in the world to gain some of the incredible wisdom and insight that the Buddhists offer. This is really where the rubber meets the road. Why should we accept stuff that doesn't make sense to us, or that even seems illogical? And often when you really look within systems, you can see, well, there might, in fact, be a valid reason for this. But then the question really is, do I need to take this on or not?
Right. It's how does this contribute to your practice? What works for you?
Exactly. And then you can add the layer onto it, though. And this is a tough one for we North Americans who are raised with healthy egos, is how much is my insistence of doing it a la Frank Sinatra my way, which itself undercuts more of what Buddhism is all about than any petty things about the rule. Oh, I'm going to be enlightened, but I'm going to do it my way, damn it.
Right. And that's one of the issues that we run into with a secular Buddhism is that there's the impression that it's about tearing down religion, and that's not it. It's about having a practice that fits into whatever resonates best with you. And we're not saying that means pandemonium and interpreting it to be completely something it isn't. We are talking about sticking with what is shown to be accurate. This is the Four Noble Truths and the path itself. But the forms of that's where we want to separate out. Well, this is a cultural add-on to what the practice is that may not be appropriate for you. There may be other things that are culturally appropriate for us in a modern Western context that we haven't found yet because it's so new to us.
Yes. And isn't this one of the key things? And frankly, Ted, this is one of the things that makes me really excited about Buddhism in the West in the 21st century, is when you look at the countries that have been radically transformed by Buddhism, it was a 200 or 300 year process.
Right.
It didn't happen in a generation. You look at what happened in China when Buddhism came in and basically turned the whole country into Buddhist. The same thing with Japan, even Tibet. It was a long, long process. Everybody who's sitting on a map or struggling with the Four Noble Truths, they're part of what could be another of the great historical shifts of Buddhism as it does what it does so well, which is take these profound insights and transplant them in foreign cultures.
Right. Yeah,
and,
we're living in exciting times.
yeah, and I think especially the scientific bent of Western society, the sort of non-mythological bent that many of us have, I think that's got the potential to give us a brand new form of scientific Buddhism. Who knows what that's going to be like? So although I really intensely value places like Pananachat that have preserved tradition within the countries that those traditions rose up, what we can create in North America is something entirely different.
Yeah.
But we need those.
We're seeing that gain grounds, too, as pragmatic Buddhism, as Western Buddhism, as modern Buddhism, as secular Buddhism. There are a lot of different names of things that they're not exactly alike. They have some overlap, but clearly there's a great deal of energy around a synthesis of Buddhism that fits for us. Now, you talk about other Watts and their splendor, and you contrast that in the book a bit, and this is, I think, one of the reasons that Jim was having some struggles with the abject poverty of the villages around that. And did you see much of this kind of topsy-turvy situation of homeless monks living in greater luxury than the people who supported them?
Yes. So there's an important distinction to make between the village Watts and our monastery out in the jungle. The village Watts, where basically the sons of the villagers are studying and are practicing, they just looked like palaces. They were so beautiful. They must have been very expensive to build. But as Jim said, and I really agree with him, hey, these people can do what they want with their money for their people in their villages. This is just fine. Right there, in for many generations, the monasteries were where you sent the best and the brightest to be educated. So no problem with that. It's sort of an internal system. Our monastery, although it was, I would say, more austere. We were living in very simple huts in the jungle. There were a couple of, really only one nice building in the place, and it was still a very simple construction of the main sala or worship hall. But it was very simple. So it wasn't that the monks were living in luxury. It's that when you're a monk, you're not actually doing any productive work of any kind. In fact, you're really prohibited from doing work of exactly that kind. So you're sitting on your butts and you're meditating, or you're doing walking meditation, or you're tidying up and sweeping and things like that, and chanting, but you only have a religious function in the society. And the case that Jim was making that he found difficult was the reason Thai villagers are supporting a group that's more than 50% Westerner doing this is because they believe they are gaining merit for their next incarnations. And if you don't buy the philosophical notion that one gets special good karma added to your account by giving money or food to monks, if you don't buy that notion, then the whole thing seems like a real sham, a real sort of bait and switch for these poor Thai villagers who, could be using the money and the food that they give to us to better their own conditions, or maybe even buy nicer stuff for their own sons in their own monasteries. So that, I think, is where there's a good question for foreigners who go to any country to practice is, are you actually providing value for those who are supporting you? Well, within their own system, yes, but I gotta say, I found the whole way that Buddhism fit into Thai culture to be pretty disturbing. And if you like, I could explain why I found that.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
So, pretty much everybody in Thailand is a Buddhist. There's a small Muslim population, but that Buddhist layer is actually like a veneer over the wood of the Thai religious consciousness, if you like. Underneath that veneer is a deep layer of Hindu beliefs. So the belief in reincarnation, the myths that the Thais tell are still things like the Ramayana. So there's this large Hinduism layer underneath the Buddhism, and then underneath the Hinduism sort of bedrock are these animist traditions. So the Thais have lots of superstitions around ghosts and spirits. Every traditional Thai house has a little spirit house in front of it, and they're quite concerned with how to deal with the spirit world that interpenetrates our own world. And in dealing with the monks, they mostly give to the monks in order to have a better rebirth for themselves in material terms. So it's kind of like in the old days in European Catholicism, where nobles would do terrible things, and then they give a bunch of gold to the church, or they build a cathedral, and they get dispensation for their sins.
Or they buy indulgences. Here is a price buy sin.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there's kind of that going on. And also the monks are also often sometimes consulted for things like fortune telling, and they do special blessings, right? So the monks would come and they would bless a new building or a new school or a new business. And that is just so not what the Buddha taught monks are supposed to do, right?
Well, in fact, fortune telling is strictly prohibited. It's listed as one of the things that you can't do as right livelihood. Exactly.
And yet you find this, rather widespread in Thailand. Not at my monastery, but, we found lots of places where monks are doing fortune telling. So, how much of that is, in a sense, kind of bad faith? It's kind of taking advantage of the superstitions and these other beliefs of Thai people because it creates, a comfortable relationship. Now, I'm afraid if any of your listeners here are Thais and they're going to go back and report me to the Thai monastic authorities, I'm going to be in more trouble than I already am with them. But, that's really how it seemed to me when I sort of step back and look at it. There's not complete integrity with the monastic community in being clear with the Thai people what the job of the monk really is and what can be expected from monks in your next life.
Well, and you're not the only person to point this out. There is a monk who has written something that has been highly critical of Buddhism in Thailand, that there is this kind of perversion of what the Buddha taught. And that much of I think some of what you're talking about something I struggle with as well, is the idea that the magical thinking and the merit making, that kind of stuff, is willingness to be in a really difficult situation in this life, and that you actively put off making things better in this lifetime because you're building a brownie points in that magical bank account of merit for another lifetime. And that I would see this as one of the harmful effects of this kind of interpretation of Buddhist teaching.
Right. And ultimately, it then feeds into a ego-protective view of yourself. I mean, if people are doing things in this life so that their personal incarnation has a better next life, that's kind of like, the Christians who don't rob, steal, or kill because, they want to go to heaven. Well, they'll get a reward. Maybe it keeps certain people from having real bad behavior, but it's not really moving your
internally
spirit or your consciousness away from a non-ego-centered place.
It's funny because I occasionally post quotes on the Facebook fan page. I have a quotes page of stuff various people have said, including me, on the website. And one I was just thinking about last night is having to do with the idea that, sure, there's the idea of behaving right in order to get a better lifetime. I mean, the net result with that is you're doing good deeds, or you're not doing bad stuff. Sure. But there's an additional level of benefit in one's own mind that if you're just doing the physical acts, but you're not having this deep transformative effects of the practice internally, that there's more stuff there that you could be doing that could be positively beneficial, for one thing. And B, if you're not actually transforming the mind, that moment by moment by moment by moment, in some ways, that still negative mind aspect is going to manifest itself. Even though you do a pretty good job of adhering to the rules because of concern for next life, it's not as effective as internal transformation and internally making yourself a better person.
Right. Now, the classic Theravada response to that would be, until you have followed the rules long enough, your mind is not even going to be potentially fertile ground for hearing real truth. That, in other words, behavior precedes the possibility of change. And so only by practicing correct behavior through many lifetimes can you even get to a point where you're going to be able to change it. Now, that's, of course, where for we in the West, the rubber really meets the road. I mean, the key question is, if you only have this one lifetime, then you die. That is it. Then should you be practicing Buddhist meditation? Does it make this present life better? And if that's the case, then do you really want to spend it just doing mindless obedience to certain rules, or do you want to get right down to the good stuff? But on the other hand, Westerners who try to rush their way to enlightenment often miss the boat because of their haste.
Right. I want to segue from the idea of merit making as an industry into your meeting with Ajahn Chah. And one of the things I want to do for the listeners who are not familiar with Ajahn Chah is really a Thai hero for Buddhism. He did the full wandering monk practice, and he actually founded this particular Wat that we're talking about. And you met him towards the end of his life, and this ties into what we've been talking about, the merit-making industry. Tell us about that circumstance, because for me, this is one of the most poignant parts of your book.
Yes. By the time I arrived in Pananachat, Ajahn Chah had a stroke, which left him completely paralyzed. There was no visible sign that his mind was still active within his body. It's basically a breathing corpse. And what I had been told was that before he died, or before he had that stroke, some years before, he gave his monks the instructions that under no circumstances should anything be used to prolong his life. And monks actually took this as prescience that he foresaw he was going to have a stroke. But then when he had a stroke, they started intravenous feeding him. They shuttled him back and forth from the hospital. They built a special air-conditioned hut for him to live in, where he had 24-hour-a-day care by various monks who saw it as a great honor to be able to watch over him. So, I mean, for somebody who spent his life teaching impermanence, I mean, this really seems like the ultimate inability to follow that teaching on the part of his students. The monks said, when it came right down to it, we just couldn't let him die. And as a human, I also really appreciate and understand that. But what I came to discover is that in terms of the whole time merit-making business, as long as he's alive, then giving donations to the monastery of an enlightened monk is like about the best merit you can make in the business. So the monasteries that Ajahn Chah had founded were just raking in great donations. That's all I've heard. I don't know the actual numbers or anything like that. And they were building a huge mausoleum to his memory where his body was going to be interred. Just all these sorts of things that, from my own young Buddhist perspective, really made me sort of go, oh, big mausoleum to worship and venerate him forever, when he said everything's impermanent, let me die.
And this is very clear in his. There are several books that that were written and translated into English, and I got to say, Ajahn Chah is one of my favorite teachers. I can see why people really respected him as an arhat, because what he said really it's inspiring to people who are doing this practice, and it doesn't mean you have to be a Dhutanga monk. It doesn't mean you have to do it in that fashion, but many of these talks were geared towards Westerners, were lay people, and it's very effective teaching, and he does talk about impermanence, that things do pass, and yet this seems to be in conflict to that and in support of a merit-making industry. And you described many Watts that were founded under his auspices that didn't have anything to do with him specifically. Tell us about your specific encounter with him when you went to see him. Yes.
So I went with one of the monks I respected most from my own monastery, which is about 5 miles away from the monastery where Ajahn Chah had his resting place, let's say. And so we did the long walk there, and then we had an audience with him. And I really felt so much gratitude towards this man, and many of the monks that I had gotten to know told me about incidents in their lives where he was able to really move them in the right direction, and the stories were always ones of real authenticity and insight and care, and you could sort of feel that echo in Panana Chat, despite everything else that was really there. And I wanted to just go and say thanks and really honestly bow in reverence before this man who'd done so much to revive this whole tradition. But I had to say it was shocking to see the actual man, in his wheelchair, completely flaccid, one monk with a little fan to keep the mosquitoes off, and to me it was just like he was a breathing corpse. Every now and then his eyes would open, but they would not focus. I believe that at one point they even were going in different directions, and I found it really hard to imagine a conscious being there, and how much worse if there was a conscious being in there. I would personally hate to be in that sort of a situation where I want to let go, but everybody's keeping me alive.
Right, and against his will.
Yeah, well, that's right too. And then to hear some of the other monks saying, "Oh, he has such a beautiful presence, and he gives us a teaching every day, and impermanence when we see him, and an arm would flop, and people would read great significance into what he might mean by this." And it was just hard for me. It was literally hard for me. I found myself feeling both anguish and also anger, and really, near the end of my stay, here I am experiencing some of the most violently angry responses possible from seeing this great man, the founder, and impotent anger, because I knew there's nothing that I could possibly do about it. I think it was writing that particular passage that really, more than anything else, kind of put me on the outs with the community once the book came out. But I still find it hard to remember that, to see such a great man.
Well, indeed, in any human being suffering in that way, and whether he was consciousness was there, or if really the brain had kind of checked out, we don't know. But it was just, it's hard in reading that passage, just seeing that there's someone who's perhaps experiencing this, if they're in and just they can't move, they're trapped. But knowing that this is absolutely not what he wanted to have happen, and that his own wishes were overruled because, well, we just couldn't let him go. And I'm sorry, that's attachment. At what point do you think that's attachment?
Yes.
You mentioned that this book, this is a good segue. You mentioned that this passage in particular is one of the reasons that kind of had you on the outs, that the book became notorious in Thai Buddhist circles. what happened when you went back? Because that's in the new forward, and I want you to talk about that.
Yes.
A bit.
About 10 years after I left the monastery, I was given an assignment to go back to Thailand and write an airline magazine article on foreigners who become Buddhist monks. So I went to I was in Bangkok. I didn't have enough time to get to Pananachat, but I was in Bangkok, and I went to a monastery where I knew there were several foreign monks, and I had prearranged for them to meet me. So we all got together, and we were sitting under a tree in the compound of the monastery. And I was just sort of explaining my assignments and what I wanted to hear from each of them. I had a little tape recorder. I just wanted to get them on tape talking about their own journeys. And as I was sort of doing the preamble, one of the monks said, "Wait a minute. You said you were Canadian and your name is Tim Ward. Did you write a book?" And I remember thinking, "Oh, yeah. Oh, this is great. They've actually heard of the book." So I said, "Yeah, I wrote What the Buddha Never Taught." At that point, they all sort of got up and said, "Oh, we can't talk to you. We got to go." They're like looking around really nervously. And I was like, What? And they said, "Well, you wrote this book that was like an expose of the monastery, just trying to make it look bad, for your own purposes." I'm like, "No, that's not what the book is. It's it's meant to show what really happened, just from my perspective. But you guys, you've read it, so you know." And they said, "Oh no, we would never read a book such as this."
Yeah, it's funny because they're condemning you for what you wrote, but they've never read it, so they have no idea what you wrote.
That's right. And at this point, all that I can say is I thought of Salman Rushdie.
Yeah,
who that point, had to be in hiding because of the Islamic fatwa on his head for writing the satanic verses. And I remember thinking, man, it's a good thing the Buddhists don't do fatwas. They're obviously ready to just let my karma take care of me on its own sweet
it's
time.
That's it exactly. And Rushdie has said, there are books to kill people over. This isn't one of them.
Yeah.
Of the satanic verses. And one of my dearest friends at high school gave me that book, and I've still got it on my bookshelf. And I treasure that because it is something that it makes one think. And what you do with this book is the same thing. You make people think. You're honest about the events that occur and your opinions on them. It's not to say that there isn't really deep and wonderful practice that is alive and well and very active in Thailand. I think we do see that a lot. And even in these circumstances, which many took as a very negative response and was even represented as an expose, which it wasn't, there were still good things that you took away from there. That's one of the things I want to ask about as well. What were some of the positive experiences you took away from your time at the Wat?
Mm-hmm. Let me speak specifically to three things. The first is it changed my attitude towards nature and the world. Because we were required to follow the precept, don't harm any living things, mosquito larvae aside, we were told not to kill mosquitoes when they landed on you. Not to, the forest floor was filled with scorpions and cobras and adders and these large poisonous centipedes and tarantulas. We had to live amongst these creatures without harming them and respecting them. And one of the things that I really came to learn was that they don't mean us ill. And our Western attitude tends to be to see anything that could hurt us as an enemy that we better destroy. I just watched True Grit, that great
excellent movie.
movie that just came out. And there's one scene involving a nest of rattlesnakes that gets disturbed, and the character plays Rooster Cockburn. He comes in and he sees this and he just pulls out his gun and bam, 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 he shoots all the snakes. So seeing that these creatures aren't actually out to harm us really changed my own sense of my relationship with nature. And not that I don't swat mosquitoes today and don't do it mindlessly. I do, but I carry with me this sense of nature as part of me, and me as part of nature, that is much more benign than I think my default mode as a North American was. So that's one. The other is a great teaching of Ajahn Chah called The Parable of the Dog with Mange, which he attributed to the Buddha, but I think it's his. And this is basically a parable of what the mind is like. He recalls he recounted the story of the Buddha with some of his disciples watching a mangy dog running around a field, and it would go to different places and change its position, roll over, stand up, go somewhere else. And the Buddha said, this dog has mange. It thinks it can get comfortable by changing its position, but it never will because the mange is on its back. This is what it is to be a human. We have mange that we carry around with us. Right? So this itchiness, this feeling of dissatisfaction, we tend to blame on our job, our relationship, our health. But we'll carry that dissatisfaction with us no matter what our circumstances are. So the Buddhist way is just to live with that dissatisfaction rather than trying to change your circumstances to get rid of it, because you never will. But that to me was a profound, life-changing insight. The third one is much more intangible, and it goes right to the title of the book, What the Buddha Never Taught, into the nature of the self. And one of the things that to me came out to be a paradox in Buddhism is this idea that you should strive with all your might to become enlightened. But then when you're enlightened, the I am disappears. So what is it that's enlightened? Why would the I am strive towards its own destruction? And I've never been able to get away from that thought. What is the nature of the self? Is it an illusion? Why is it such a powerful illusion? I don't buy the Buddhist explanation of where this powerful illusion came from. Is it something real, like a soul? I don't buy that mythology either. So who is this self that I am? And I'm just right now finishing up a book which tries to grapple with this, with sort of having a one Buddhist eye and one scientific eye open to look at it.
Well, that'll be a good segue. I want to ask about, we'll get to other books that you've written and what you're writing now in a second, but I want to ask you first, what you see as the natural evolution of Buddhism in modern Western culture.
Okay, the natural evolution of Buddhism. I think we've gone through the first blush of romance stage.
Honeymoon's over.
That's right. Or the new fashion stage, where people throw themselves at Buddhism literally as their salvation. And it's been a violent, rough, and fascinating courtship between the West and Buddhism, and also violent for some Buddhist teachers who I think just couldn't handle the adulation of many Western adherents. I think mostly of Chogyam Trungpa and Dharma Datu, who tragically ended up drinking himself to death. The way Westerners adore somebody when they decide they've got the answer is positively frightening. So there's this infatuation stage, I think, is gone, and now we're probably it's probably be true to say that we're in a stage where there's some long-term serious Western practitioners who are doing it much more on their own terms, and we're kind of in the reinventing Buddhism to find out how to make it fit phase. And I think what's important during that phase is to have people who are really ready to be pioneers, really ready to put their own lives on the line with their own practices, their own designs, their own research in a sense. But also, it's good to keep us connected to the historical Buddhist traditions that are out there also. Not that I personally would be comfortable myself belonging to one. I'm not Chinese, I'm not Tibetan, I'm not Thai, I'm Canadian. But there's still, I think, much that we can glean from it. And then maybe the next step is going to be to have sort of an authentic blend of different North American practices that will much better integrate scientific findings and modern psychology into Buddhism, and hopefully help us deal with what I think is one of the biggest issues for the West, and that is our sense of self. I'd like to add one other thing that I think Buddhism in the West is going to do that is just really going to be a huge leap forward over the East. That is, our Buddhism is going to be completely gender neutral.
Yeah.
Right?
You go, brother. Keep talking. Yeah.
You know, right, the historical Buddhist traditions, they basically only allowed half of humanity to put their energies towards this, and the women could clean the toilets, right?
Yeah, and we saw that recently with, interestingly, someone out of Ajahn Chah's lineage, Ajahn Brahm, doing an ordination of nuns, women who would want to become bhikkhunis. And there was a very, very big pushback from the supportive Thai community when this was done. And it was last year, so it's a pretty recent event. And I think that's where we see that there is a cultural clash with really a cutting edge at the time that Buddha did any ordination of women at all, and he did in a society that was not really structured to be accepting of that kind of thing. And we're seeing that same kind of cultural environment still in existence, where there's still a disregard for the capabilities of women. And it's interesting to note the people I've seen speak out most against this imbalance, and who have been the most supportive of women becoming ordained, are very out secular Buddhists, because it's the value there is in the human rights issue of, but there's equality here, and they're every bit as capable and should be allowed to do what they want, even though it's a tradition I myself would not actively participate in.
Right. You know, I followed this issue with great fascination and, frankly, rampant cheering on the sidelines for Ajahn Brahma, who I think was very brave to do what he did. Two little wrinkles in this for your listeners who may have heard of this but don't know some of the particular details. The community, and it's the Ajahn Chah Sangha, right? The Sangha of all the monasteries which have grown up around Ajahn Chah. That's the people in Thailand we're talking about, both Thais and foreigners. They say that their real beef was that Ajahn Brahma did not ask for permission to do this. In fact, they were going to have a discussion about whether or not ordination should be contemplated, and he went ahead and did it anyway. So that was their beef, which the folks in Perth, Australia, where Ajahn Chah's monastery is, say that's really not the issue at all. And they quote actually some nasty emails that were sent out from the Thai community, the Thai monasteries, to others saying no longer support this monastery. And what the Thai communities did was they excommunicated Ajahn Brahma and his monastery from the Ajahn Chah Sangha. So you can't actually excommunicate someone like a Catholic can, you're going to hell. But you can say, you are no longer part of our brotherhood. So you've been cut off from that. They're still ordained, they're still practicing, they're still of the way, but they're not together anymore with this particular group. The other thing that Ajahn Brahma did though, that was very, I have to say, clever of him and wise of him, is he himself oversaw the ordination of these several women as bhikkhunis, as nuns, but he didn't do the ordination himself. He brought a nun from Sri Lanka to Australia, and she's the one who did this ceremony. And since I believe this involves some like physical touching, monks are not supposed to touch women. So if he had done that, it would have been a clear and serious violation of his vows. So I think there's still going to be some play out in this whole drama, but I hope that to me it's a clear and courageous message. Not only that individuals, male or female, should have the full right to practice the tradition, but also we as humankind can't afford to turn back somebody who is at the door on this task of making the human mind reach its potential.
Mm-hmm. And it's beautifully said. Yes, you're absolutely right. And that's one of the sad things, that we see a negative influence of a cultural trappings or attitudes towards one's spiritual practice. That's where I also have a red flag raised that, yes, at the same time, I don't want to sit in judgment of what another culture's values should be. Absolutely agreed. However, and I've mentioned this a few times. I'm reading Sam Harris' new book, The Moral Landscape, and he brings up the point that it is perfectly legitimate for us to bring up and question things that are viewed as clearly limiting or harmful to an individual's rights and freedoms and even their person in some cases. And I think that is an appropriate thing for us to question. And one of the ideas of a secular approach to this is that we be able to, and the phrase I've been using, use it today, it's a good phrase, is question with confidence, that we can bring up questions, we can ask not in a token lip service response kind of way, but genuinely question and genuinely get answers that make sense within the realm of the natural world, things that we can show. And this is one of those things where it just doesn't hold water, this cultural response that no, women this shouldn't have been allowed. Like, no, you're prevaricating. That's not so. The problem you have is women being ordained. There's no way around that.
Yeah.
I want to segue into some of your other books. What the Buddha Never Taught is really part of a trilogy, and I want you to tell a little bit about the other books that you have in that as well.
Sure. I wrote 3 books altogether out of my time traveling in Asia, and they actually reflect the major divisions within Buddhism. So What the Buddha Never Taught, the first book, is pretty much a look at the Theravada tradition. The second book, called The Great Dragon's Fleas, is a look at the Mahayana tradition, this sort of great vehicle tradition. And this is a book of short stories of things that I encountered in strange spiritual places all throughout Asia. Everything from learning about the Buddha's sex change in China, the island of Puto Shan, and how Avalokiteshvara became a woman in China, to meeting the Dalai Lama in India, and meeting Sai Baba in South India, as well as meeting some of the Thai fortune tellers and spirit-possessed mediums, some of whom are monks, in Thailand. So it's just this sort of big picture of all the things that happen in extreme corners of Asia. That's the second book. And then the third book is really my Tibetan Buddhist book, my Vajrayana book, and it is about basically a tantric love affair that I had while traveling across India with a woman who was doing her PhD on Indian art, and it goes deeply into early Buddhist mythology, but also into various tantric practices, and that's called Arousing the Goddess.
Now, you also mentioned that you're writing a book now. Tell us about that.
Yes, I am. I'm in the middle of finishing up a book based on my experience climbing Mount Kilimanjaro last summer with my son, who's now 20 years old.
Wow, awesome.
Yeah, almost the age that I was. I was 25 when I was at Pananachat, so he's almost at that age that I was. And part of this book is sort of father-son transmission. I wanted to sort of talk through some ideas that I've been working through myself, amongst them on what it is, on what the self actually is, and I see our the stories that we tell about ourselves do a lot to actually create who we are and how interdependent we are, because it's the stories other people carry in our heads that do much to define us as well. So those are some of the things that I'm working with in a book that's titled Zombies on Kilimanjaro.
You know, we did, the Halloween episode this past year was on Buddhism and zombies. So we've already actually talked about zombies on the Secular Buddhist podcast. I'm hoping to have you come back on the podcast when that book comes out and speak about it. I hope we get a chance to chat about that. It'd be wonderful. Folks listening, just a reminder, on the episode page for this episode, there's a separate link for the 20th anniversary edition of the book, What the Buddha Never Taught. So, Tim, you also have an event coming up that's really very quickly coming up in Vancouver. Tell us about that.
Yes, I'm going to be in Vancouver the week of the 7th through the 11th of February. I went to university in Vancouver, and audiences there have always been really kind to me. I think we all have the same sort of spiritual vibe. So this is a major talk at the Vancouver Public Library, which is going to be on February the 10th. It's a free public talk, and I'll be speaking about what the Buddha never taught and reading from the 20th anniversary edition. I'm going to be doing a couple of other talks and lectures at universities as well, at the University of British Columbia, my old alma mater, the University of Victoria, and Pearson College, those last two on Vancouver Island. Anybody who's in the Vancouver area, I'm also going to be doing tons of local media, so stay tuned. You may catch me on the airwaves. So looking so forward to going back to Vancouver. It's a city I love, and one filled with Buddhists and quasi-Buddhists trying to find their own way forward into an enlightened future.
Tim Ward can be found at www.timwardsbooks.com. That's TIMWARDS books.com. Tim Ward, thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on The Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.